The Linux kernel is a massive project that has billions of dollars riding on it every single day, whether that be in supercomputers, web servers, or even in car computers. And every day that Linux gets older, so do the current lineup of maintainers, and one day these maintainers will have to retire. And this is a bit of a problem, and that's because being a maintainer for something like the Linux kernel sounds like a horrendously boring job. Now, I'll talk about what a maintainer does in just a bit, but for now, just know that I think that it sounds horrendously boring, and Linus sees this as a bit of a problem as well. And in this article from the Register, Linus Torvalds ponders the future of Linux and says that it's really hard to find maintainers. Now, someone might say that, well, that's probably because Linus Torvalds is a meanie man, and maybe that's a factor for somebody, but there's actual reasons why you wouldn't want to maintain something like the Linux kernel, because it's a pretty big job. Now, I'm not going to read through this entire article because a lot of it is simply fluff, but just so you know, this is a write-up about a keynote that happened between Dirk Hondo, who is VMware's Chief Open Source Officer, and also Linus Torvalds, who I probably shouldn't have to explain on a Linux channel, but if you don't know, he is the creator of Linux. Now, if you want to go read the entire article for yourself, there'll be a link to it down below. So skipping over all of this right here, we're going to go all the way down to this section here. So Linux, the next generation. The talk soon turned to an uncomfortable question: what will happen to Linux when the current generation of maintainers moves on? With Torvalds and many of the leaders in their 50s and 60s, at some point we as a community need to start thinking about generational change. What do we do? Asked Hondo. And Torvalds answered by saying that the Linux kernel community as a whole is not so old. A lot of new people who are not 50 years old, they are often the ones who are doing the real work, he said. The people who have been around for 3 decades, yes, we are getting grey and old, but the people who have been around for a long time, we've moved into maintenance and management. However, this doesn't mean that there isn't going to be a problem for the Linux kernel in the next couple of years, because as I said in the intro, this is where the real problem is going to start happening. Yes, there's still a lot of young people who want to work on Linux kernel, who want to actually do development for it, but development isn't the only thing that goes into actually running a project like this. Sure, with like a small project with maybe 2, 3, 4, even up to 10 people, you can kind of get away with just having a team of developers. But with something at the scale of the Linux kernel that has so much money riding on it, you need to have people who are actually maintaining the project. And then it says there is an issue though. It turns out that it's really hard to find people who are maintainers, said Torvalds. And then it goes on to explain that in the past, Linus Torvalds has said some mean things to developers and to maintainers, but that's not the point of this video. There are legitimate reasons why you actually wouldn't want to be the maintainer on something at the scale of the Linux kernel, or really any other sort of big project for that matter. So you might be wondering what a project maintainer actually does. And I would say that the best way to look at them is sort of like a project director or part of a project committee. So what they're doing, they're going to be emailing people like the maintainers and the developers so they can kind of work out the sort of direction they want to take the project. Then they'll be looking at other projects so they can say, okay, well, is this a cool technology that we want to bring into the Linux kernel, or do we want to leave that out and then go on to some other thing? Or do we even need to be thinking about this in general? And then also forming partnerships with other projects. So if they do want to be bringing in some sort of file system, well, what they can do is form a partnership with that project and then, I guess, mutually benefit each other by both advertising each other, and it's sort of a win-win situation in that regard. So basically the maintainer or the committee of maintainers are pretty much steering the ship of the project in the direction they want to take the project. And this is basically going to ensure that the developers know what they're actually doing, because if you leave developers up to their own devices, most projects are just going to fall apart. Now, if you've only ever worked on a very small project, it's probably not going to be that much of a problem. Maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 people, they can kind of maintain the project by themselves. But when you get to the scale of something like the Linux kernel, or really even at the scale of something like Kden Live, at that point, if you just leave the developers up to doing whatever they want to do, a project is going to fall apart very, very quickly, because what you're going to have happen is you're going to have a click form trying to do one thing, and then another click trying to form and do another thing, and the first click is going to take the project in one direction, the other click is going to take it in another direction, and maybe at that point you'll see a fork in the project, which might not necessarily be a bad thing, but if you're trying to maintain a consistent project like the Linux kernel, you probably don't want your developers forking off into different directions, doing things that completely conflict with each other, and basically the maintainer is there to make sure that that doesn't actually happen. So going back to the article, one of the downsides of being a kernel maintainer is you just have to be there all the time, Torvalds continued, is every day you read email, you react to email, you just have to be there, and it's not necessarily a very easy niche to get into. And for me, that sounds like a terrible job that I would never want to do. So we do not have enough maintainers. We have a lot of people who write code. We have a fair number of maintainers, but it's hard to find people who really look at other people's code and funnel that code upstream all the way eventually to my tree. It is one of the main issues we have. And this raises another issue with being a maintainer. So to be a maintainer on a project, you sort of have to know as much, or even in some cases more than the developers, because what you have to do is when a developer pushes their patch up to the tree, you have to look at that patch and make sure that patch is doing exactly what it's supposed to be doing. That patch doesn't break anything else. So if you're trying to do one thing over here and another thing over here, you have to make sure that those patches don't conflict with each other. And also you have to make sure that the patch actually matches the project style. Now that's probably the easiest part of all of that, and generally you can pretty much automate a lot of that. But in some cases when it comes to, say, commenting style, it's going to be very difficult to do that automatically. So you have to understand what the style of commenting you want to do on the project is, and make sure that everything does fit that, and that everything else does fit that. And it's just kind of a mess to make sure that everything that's going into the project does line up properly. And because this is such an important job, there's a very serious problem with trying to onboard maintainers. So going on to the next point, the problem is that it takes time to build up trust in the community. It's not just trust from other maintainers, it's also trust from all the people who are writing the code, and that just takes time, said Torvalds. 30 years ago when we started, we didn't need that. It was like you showed up, you got the job. So many people now depend on the kernel, you can't do the wild and crazy things that we used to do. So when it actually comes to onboarding a maintainer, in the past, Linux was much smaller, both on the server space and also on the desktop space. Even in the 90s, Linux was being used for web servers because obviously Linux is free, so if you're a kid who wants to set up a web server, well, do it with Linux because you don't have to pay for anything. But obviously companies were doing it as well because if you don't have to pay for something, you're obviously going to save money on it. Now, it was still going to be a problem if something broke back then, but it's not like billions and billions of dollars was actually riding on it being stable. But when it comes to being a maintainer, it's a little bit different from onboarding a developer. So when you onboard a developer, they can start off from being a junior and work their way up the seniority hierarchy. So with a junior developer, you won't give them something like integrating some sort of new file system into the Linux kernel. That would be insane. Don't do that. What you would do is you would give them something that if it's not done exactly perfectly, it's not that big of a deal, and they can work on it over time and they can get better at it. And eventually they'll work their way up and up and up, and eventually get to the point where, hey, now they can work on that difficult task. They can make some sort of critical driver. They can integrate some sort of file system. But you're not going to give that work to the junior developer. But when it comes to being a maintainer, obviously you're not going to bring on a maintainer who's never maintained another project. But there's not many people who have maintained something at the scale of the Linux kernel. So what's going to happen is they're going to go from being a maintainer of maybe a smaller project to being thrust into being a Linux kernel maintainer. And this is going to be a massive shift. And because this maintainer doesn't really have much experience working with the Linux kernel, obviously they would have been a developer in the past, but being a developer and being a manager is a very, very different task. So these people who come on as the new managers, who come on as the new maintainers, they won't really have the same level of trust that the older maintainers will have from the community. So even though there may not be an explicit hierarchy of trust, obviously there's going to be an implicit one where the new maintainers, they're going to be at the bottom, and what they say isn't really going to be taken as seriously as something that, say, Linus Torvalds says, because Linus Torvalds has been around longer than anyone else has. Obviously, the longer you stay on a project and you say sensible things, the more trust you're going to build up over time. But this takes a very, very long time to see happen. And when you bring on a new maintainer, they might kind of feel disenfranchised because what they're saying isn't really going to be taken as seriously because they don't have the same level of trust that some of those older maintainers would have. And I could see why someone would want to leave a project because of that. Now, I don't have a better solution for this. This is kind of just how the software industry works. So I'm not saying this is necessarily a bad thing or if it's a good thing or anything like that. All I'm saying is this is kind of the state that it's in. So obviously, as time goes on, as the older maintainers leave the project, there's going to be a problem with onboarding new maintainers. But over the next maybe 10, 15, 20 years, we might also start seeing a problem on the development side as well. And that's because the Linux kernel is written in C. So Hondell asked, is there a risk that we're becoming the COBOL programmers of the 2030s. I'll explain what happened with COBOL in just a bit, but keep that in mind for just a moment. So, Torvalds answered by saying that C is still one of the top 10 languages. However, he said that for things that are not central to the kernel itself, like drivers, the kernel team is looking at having interfaces to do those, for example, in Rust. I'm convinced it's going to happen. It might not be Rust, but it is going to happen, that we'll have different models for writing these kinds of things, and C won't be the only one. So right now, C is obviously the main kernel language, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. Now, C is not going away anytime soon. It's still a very, very popular language, but that doesn't mean that it will always be a popular language. And as was brought up in the article, COBOL is a really good example. So COBOL, if you don't know, was primarily being used for business, finance, and administrative systems, and it was mainly being deployed on mainframes. And as years went by, a lot of these projects were migrated to newer languages because a lot of the developers who were working on COBOL have shifted to those languages, and there was just less and less COBOL developers. So if there's not really that many developers around to actually work on your system, you pretty much have to shift over to something that people are actually using. And this caused a bit of a problem because as more projects were shifted over away from COBOL, more developers shifted away from COBOL. And now we have a lot of COBOL projects that still exist in very, very important places, but there's basically no COBOL developers. So for example, the banking industry relies very heavily on COBOL, and there's not really anyone around to actually maintain these systems. So because there's no one around to maintain them, there's also no one around to actually migrate them. And this problem is only going to get worse and worse over time, because as there's very little work, there's very little reason to actually learn the language. And because no one's learning the language, no one has junior jobs. And because no one has junior jobs, there won't be any future senior jobs. And this just kind of compiles and compiles over time. Now, for a language like C, you might not think that's actually going to be possible. But it also happened with Fortran and Algol and countless other languages that existed within the past. And one day, it's very possible that the exact same thing is going to happen to C. People might move over to Rust, or whatever the new cool low-level language is at the time. But one day, it's very possible that people will stop using C. And if people stop using C and the Linux kernel is still on C, then we've got the COBOL problem. Now, even though Rust is getting really, really popular and a lot of new C work is being done in Rust, I don't think that the popularity of C is going to die out anytime soon. I still think that it is a really good language to learn, and at least maybe for another 10, 15, 20 years, there's still going to be a lot of C work that does exist. But that doesn't mean that it will always be there, and if you leave it to the last minute, it's going to be the same problem that happened with COBOL. But I don't know what the best solution is going to be. This is going to be up to the maintainers, and this is another reason why we need competent maintainers actually working on the Linux kernel, because these are the people who are going to decide, okay, do we actually need to migrate to a different language, or is it okay to stay on C? Are there still developers who still want to work on the project, even though it's written in a language that far less people are using now? That's why we need competent maintainers, because the developers won't be able to decide this amongst themselves. There is way too many developers to deal with that. That is why you have the maintainers there. And the last point that is brought up in this article is about Linux on ARM. So I think the fact that Apple is moving to ARM will help the ARM ecosystem from a development standpoint. I'm hoping that in a few years, there will be a powerful ARM desktop that you can actually use for development. Now, Hondel brings up cloud development using ARM, but Torvalds responds by saying, but cloud development is not the kind of development that most kernel developers want to do. You want to have the machine in front of you. You don't just want to develop for ARM. You want to use ARM day to day on the desktop. That's my feeling. And personally, I agree with him as well. So if you don't know, Apple is going to be migrating all of their new Macs from Intel to ARM. Now, some people might say, well, why does this matter? Because you're not going to be able to run Linux on it anyway. Now, as Torvalds said, there's going to be a lot more developers who actually want to work with ARM. And this means there's going to be a lot more people who potentially want to buy ARM hardware. And maybe one day we'll actually have a powerful ARM desktop. Because with Apple moving to ARM, what this shows is that ARM is now capable of being a true desktop CPU architecture. It's not just something you stick in a phone because you want to save some power. It's something you can actually build a computer out of. And for better or worse, Apple tends to be a trendsetter, so they got rid of the headphone jacks on their phone, everyone else started doing it, they brought in the notch for their phones, everyone else started doing it, and there's countless other examples where Apple starts doing something and then everyone else follows suit. So maybe in the near future we'll start seeing powerful ARM desktop hardware. I don't know, I'd be entirely happy to run Arch Linux on ARM. That would be pretty cool. Now, I know I can already do it if I went and bought like a Raspberry Pi, but imagine being able to just make my regular sorts of videos on an ARM system. That would be really, really cool. And maybe it's not going to be ready in a couple of years, but at some point I do hope that we do have the ability to really use ARM on the desktop. So let me know, where do you think that Linux is going to go in the future? Is it going to be fine without the original maintainers who are working on it? Or is it going to just completely fall apart and just go into some random direction and we're all going to move over to something like BSD? Let me know what your thoughts are down below. And before I go, I want to thank my patrons. So a special thank you to Joachim, Craig, Nathan, Andrew, P.D. Road, Tony Donald, and Silver. If you want to join the Patreon, there'll be a link to that down below, as well as my Amazon affiliate links where you can buy the gear in this channel, or anything else you want and a small kickback for. Also, you can go check out my podcast, that is Tech of a Tea, available on Library and YouTube, and the audio version available wherever you listen to audio podcasts. Also, remember to check out this channel, also available on Library, BitTube, and BitChute. And remember to smash the like button and leave me a comment down below, and remember to subscribe and ding the little bell icon down below as well. So I think that's pretty much everything for me, and I'm out.